Congressman. I'm probably going to kick us off. I'm Stella. You've seen me on your campaign trail. First of all, let's talk about economy and jobs. You have advocated for a federal minimum wage of $20 per hour. Can you describe the approach that you would take to get it through Congress?
Yes, and I think the fundamental problem that I'm trying to address, not only with increasing the minimum wage, but also with strengthening collective bargaining, is that the economy is simply not working for millions of people. The problem is not that they're not working. The problem today is that they are working, and they're just not making enough to get by. I think candidly, given the Republican opposition to any increase in the minimum wage. And you probably remember from one of our candidate debates, Mr. Garvey, who I think speaks much for the Republican Party. Their view is the minimum wage is just fine where it is. It will require us to do away with the filibuster, and in order to make a significant increase in the minimum wage. Frankly, we should do away with the filibuster for a number of reasons, well beyond minimum wage. If we want to restore reproductive freedom, as I do, we're going to have to do away with the filibuster. If we want to rebalance the Supreme Court, expand its size, put term limits on the court, we'll need to do away with the filibuster. If we want to finally take sensible action on gun safety, pass an assault weapons ban, universal background checks, or my bill to repeal the immunity the gun industry has, we're going to have to do away with the filibuster. If we're going to restore voting rights, we'll have to do the same. So I think this is what's going to be required to make a meaningful increase in the minimum wage. We may get bipartisan support for a very modest increase, and I say maybe. Some Republicans simply don't believe in minimum wage at all, but I think we're going to have to do much more than tinker around the edges.
Is there enough political will to end the filibuster, considering that has been talked about for a long time? How would you build that political will to the point that you can do that?
Well, I think the chief impediment on the Democratic side of the aisle has been Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin is leaving the Senate. Kyrsten Sinema, at this point, I think, hasn't filed for re-election, and every day is looking less likely that she's going to run for re-election. But nevertheless, I think we're going to have to make the case, even to some of the Democrats, that we would be better off eliminating the filibuster, moving the country in a very progressive direction, than this kind of institution defeating, country defeating gridlock we have now, even if that means that when the Republicans take control from time to time, that they too will have the ability to govern. And I think their policies are so backward and reactionary and unpopular that should they have the chance to govern and put their policies into effect, they will be voted out of office in a heartbeat. But the biggest threat, I think, to our governance now is not that the policy swings wildly from direction to direction, but that it doesn't move at all, that we can barely pass a budget, that we can barely keep the government open. This, to me, is the much greater threat to our country, our inability to do the most basic things like fund the war in Ukraine right now.
Let's move on to, the proposed windfall profits tax, right, that you have supported. So where should the proceeds from that tax on corporations first go, and why?
Well, what I've been proposing is a couple of things. One is suspending the federal gas tax to give people relief at the pump. But that gas tax funds infrastructure improvements, which are really important. And the windfall profits tax on the oil companies would allow us to continue to do those, infrastructure improvements to our roads and our highways and our bridges. So it would essentially backfill for the reduction or suspension of the federal gas tax. But it would also, I think, discourage oil companies from gouging people when they feel that they can take advantage of the market. There's a war in Ukraine, and they can gouge consumers at home. It also, I hope, will help facilitate the move away from fossil fuels. We need to make a really dramatic increased investment in renewable energy and new technologies, new battery technologies. We're going to have to be able to transmit energy from where it's generated to where it needs to be used. And so I think we need to, number one, end the tax benefits and tax incentives we give the fossil fuel industry that's killing us and killing the planet. And number two, dramatically increase the incentives for renewable energy. If we're going to get ahead of the tipping point, which I still believe we can, science and technology give us the potential to do it, but we have to be incentivizing clean energy and green jobs. And I think putting a windfall profits tax on oil companies will help facilitate that transition as well.
Thank you, Congressman. Let's move on to, campaign finance and ethics. So, I know that you're one of the members of Congress who supports, trading stocks, banning members of Congress from trading stocks. So why do you support that measure, and how is it realistic considering that you yourself have a history of trading stocks from, individual companies like Pfizer, Google, and other companies?
Well, first of all, I think because some members of Congress have abused this and restore public trust, we ought to ban it for all members, including those that haven't abused it, like myself. Most of what I've done in the past has been to move away from individual stocks that we had before I was in Congress to mutual funds, which I think is fine for members to have. But nevertheless, I think there's certainly a real problem with some members and an appearance of impropriety with other members, and we're better off just banning the practice altogether. And I would go further than that. I think there's also a problem with people going through the revolving door, people who serve as regulators of an industry and then go to work for that industry, or they're at senior levels of oversight of the financial industry or the mortgage industry, and then they go to cash in, and you have to wonder, okay, whose interest do they have at heart if they're going to go cash in? So I have legislation that would crack down on the revolving door phenomenon, which I think is very much a problem as well. And even more broadly, I'm carrying the constitutional amendment in Congress to overturn Citizens United, to get dark money out of our elections. And I think that would also be obviously a very important reform, a very high bar. In the nearer term, I think we need to pass the Disclose Act, which would require disclosure of contributions, and that would, I think, bring more transparency to light and curb a lot of corporate donations that wouldn't be made if they had to be disclosed.
Yeah, so all three top Democrats in this race have talked about, right, overturning Citizens United. What would be how would it be realistic to overturn Citizens United, considering that that's been a landmark decision for such a long time?
Well, one approach that I've advocated for some time, and this would have to be done, I think, at the state level, is kind of a workaround, and that is the states decide what attributes they give corporations when they allow corporations to incorporate in their states. And so a state will decide in its code, all right, if you incorporate in California, you have this, this potential immunity from liability, or you have this benefit of incorporating here, or you have this tax structure, and these are the requirements we're going to place on you as a corporation that is essentially established here. I think we ought to make a condition of incorporation in California that you disclose all your political giving. That could have a really transformative impact. It may also, I think, survive a challenge even before this very reactionary and biased Supreme Court, because we get to define the characteristics of corporations. And imagine if a state like Delaware, where so many companies are incorporated, were to decide if you want the benefits of incorporating in Delaware, then you have to disclose your political contributions. A lot of companies simply wouldn't get involved. And to use one example, when Target years ago, I think, spent $500 on an anti-gay marriage ballot measure in Minnesota, it became public, and there was quite an outcry among the shoppers at Target and the shareholders, who basically said, if that's where you're coming from, we're not shopping at Target because of your reactionary social views. We're going to stop shopping there. And I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at the board of directors meeting where somebody said, who's the genius that got us involved in this? They then made a contribution on the other side of the ballot measure of an equal amount and said, okay, we're done. And disclosure was powerful there. And so I would try to attack it at the state level, but I would also continue trying to move forward with a constitutional amendment there's a lot of bipartisan support among the American people for campaign finance reform, for ending dark money, for ending corporate spending on elections. Where the resistance is among Republicans in Congress, but the public is very bipartisan in wanting to see this happen.
Thank you, Congressman. We're for time's sake, we're going to move on. So on foreign policy, you've been clear on your support for Israel's right to defend itself, but the civilian casualties in Gaza continue to mount. So if elected, how would you represent the varying viewpoints of Californians on this issue, including calls for conditional aid and, permanent ceasefire?
Well, I think first of all, the president is right to defend Israel. Israel has a right to defend itself. After such a horrendous attack on October 7th, the deliberate murder and torture and rape by Hamas terrorists of Israeli civilians, Hamas knew exactly what kind of response it would provoke. That was part of its strategy. At the same time that the U.S. supports Israel's right to defend itself, we need to continue urging and pressing Israel to take every step possible to avoid civilian casualties. There's nothing, I think, inconsistent with recognizing that any state, including Israel, has a duty to defend itself, particularly when a terrorist organization is threatening to attack them over and over and over again. But at the same time, recognizing that there are lots of innocent civilians in Gaza who are horrible victims of this war, and every effort has to be made to bring humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza and to reduce the number of people who are in harm's way. I'm hopeful. It seems that we are on the precipice of perhaps another agreement between Israel and Hamas for the release of hostages. It is something that the Biden administration has been working hard to negotiate, in which it would be a three-phase process. First phase would release about 40 hostages, and as we all know, some of those hostages that Hamas has are Americans, and I would certainly hope that Americans are among those released. But it would proceed in phases, and I would love to see come out of this terrible conflict is a global or regional agreement where Saudi Arabia recognizes Israel and normalizes relations with Israel. Israel recognizes a viable path to a Palestinian state, a real path to a state, and that state includes both Gaza and the West Bank under a reformed Palestinian Authority that does not include Hamas terrorists. And I think what I'm trying to do through every means that I have, and what I've tried to do over the years in my meetings with Palestinian leaders, with Israeli leaders, with other regional actors, is to do everything possible to get to that two-state solution.
So, sorry, a quick follow-up, and I would appreciate it if you could answer briefly, but are you telling the constituents who don't agree with your approach to this problem that this is the right approach to the problem?
Well, of course, I'm advocating what I think is the right approach. And I think what my constituents want and what they respect is candor. What's your view? And how are you going to work to bring about peace? And where there are differences, articulating the reasons for those differences. But also, listening to my constituents, listening to people throughout California, hearing their viewpoints, and, trying to find common ground. I don't think, as I mentioned, that it is inconsistent to grieve the loss of Israeli lives, even as we're grieving the loss of Palestinian lives, and working to try to find a long-term peaceful solution that has two states living in security and in peace. I think the predominant difference, because I would like to think most people want to see that same resolution, is how do we get there, and how do we get there in the aftermath of this horrible war?
Thank you. And then on immigration policies, you have called for a comprehensive immigration reform. So what do you mean by comprehensive? What exactly does that include?
Well, it includes a pathway to citizenship for 11 million people who are living in the shadows. It includes relief for our dreamers and our temporary protected status holders, a pathway to citizenship for our farm workers who labor so hard in the heat to put food on the table. It also includes an orderly process at the border, a much more expeditious process to decide who qualifies for asylum and who doesn't. And I think that would be something that would be truly comprehensive. Sadly, we haven't seen much interest in a comprehensive approach really since the days of George W. Bush. He was, I think, the last Republican to be interested in a comprehensive solution. And even then, he had his political guy, Karl Rove, attacking Democrats who were in difficult districts and advocating a comprehensive approach. But I think it should have those elements, and I think Alex Padilla has been a tremendous leader on this issue, and I would very much look forward to being his partner on this.
All right, passing on to my colleague, Jeannie.
Hi there. On the subject of workers, there was a big year of activity in the labor movement last year here in California, and you've mentioned your support for striking workers to be eligible to receive unemployment benefits. Given that this is a benefit that's partially paid for by employers, I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little and talk about, do you think businesses should have to be contributing to their workers going on strike to receive this benefit, and why?
I think that, given that on the other side of the table, on the business side of the table, folks continue to collect their paychecks, that they're not harmed during a strike any more than they continue to draw a paycheck, that those who are fighting for higher wages and benefits and working conditions ought to be able to do so and collect unemployment. Right now, the incentives are all aligned in the employer's favor. They can wait, they can try to outlast workers. They often do try to outlast them, knowing that the strike benefits that they get from their unions aren't adequate to meet their household expenditures, that they're essentially paying down their savings accounts, they're having to get second mortgages. And on the management side of things, they think, well, we can just outwait, and the longer we wait, the better terms we'll get. I think, change the leverage in that equation, we got to make sure that people can provide for their family while they're fighting for better benefits. So I think it's a matter not only of basic fairness, but also what we've seen since the 70s is the aggregate power of labor has declined. The corporate power in the country has dramatically increased. It is a very lopsided balance. It's the reason why wages and incomes have stayed so stagnant for years. It's why the middle class is at risk of falling out. And we need to strengthen the collective bargaining process if we want to address this. We're to this point in this country where fewer than 800 families have the accumulated wealth of more than half of the households in the country. And that's just wrong. So the current system is weighted very much in favor of corporate America and very much against working people. And one way to help change that is to make sure that when people are on the picket line fighting for themselves and their families and other working families, that they don't have to go hungry while they do.
Thanks for that. And I'm also going to be asking you a little bit about housing and homelessness, another, critical issue here back home in California. Governor Newsom has pushed for Proposition 1, that's also on the March ballot. And we were wondering, do you support this, and how would you vote on it?
Yes, I do support it. I think it's an important measure to try to address the mental health crisis and homelessness and the intersection between the two. And look, I think that the states, as they were intended to be, need to be able to experiment and find out what works. Homelessness and mental health are such profound challenges all over the country. I think what the governor is doing is a bold effort to address this, to get people off the street to help. Many who are homeless are severely mentally ill. Others have substance use problems, and the majority are economically homeless. And that, to me, is really the core of the challenge. So I don't want to overstate the mental health component. The biggest thing we can do, I think, to help people into shelter is build a lot more housing. And one of the things that I'm proposing to do is dramatically expand the low-income housing tax credit, so we can incentivize the building of hundreds of thousands of new units of affordable housing. But I do think that this proposition and the governor's effort are designed to help those who are homeless, who are in need of acute mental health services, and I think that is an important piece of the solution to this epidemic we have of homelessness.
Yeah, and it's definitely a longer term solution, longer term part of the picture. And you've mentioned also building more housing being, one of the longer term ways out of this too. But then I also wanted to ask about kind of in this emergency situation we have now where people are on the streets and there's kind of rising concern about encampments. Do you think that cities should have the ability or the authority to clear encampments in their cities for public safety and health reasons, even if there's not immediately housing available for those people?
I think that cities have to have the ability where you say there are public health or public safety issues to be able to deal with those challenges. In Los Angeles, we just had another fire, another encampment, and some of the embers from that fire set cars on fire and drifted towards apartment buildings in the area. And I think cities have to have the ability to deal with public health and dangers like those risks. But there's obviously a balance here. I certainly don't believe in criminalizing people because they can't afford a home. And so this is why I put such an emphasis, frankly, on the supply side of this, on building a lot more housing. You can give, as I would like to do, you can give renters a tax credit. I think renters who are often paying as much in their rent as homeowners are paying in their mortgage, but get no benefit on their tax return, ought to be able to deduct part of their rent on their taxes. But even if you did that, or you gave a Section 8 voucher to everyone who qualifies, as I'm also advocating, if you don't expand the amount of available affordable housing, you haven't solved the problem. You've just driven up rents further. So it all gets back to supply. But I do think mayors and councils have to deal with very real public health risks and public safety risks, and they need to have some tools to be able to do it.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you a question about crime, which is a big concern for Californians. What is one immediate piece of legislation you would propose to address these rising concerns about crime?
Well, I have a long history with this issue going back to when I was a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles. So this has always been a high priority for me. In terms of what we could do, I think probably the most important thing to deter a lot of these smash and grab robberies and theft is make sure that the people responsible get caught and that there are some certain consequences. In my experience, the certainty with which you be caught and the certainty of some consequence are more important than the length of a sentence. And right now, too many people feel immune from any accountability. So if I were going to point to one thing, I would say we're going to need to expand community-based policing with a well-trained police force to help suppress crime. But we need to go beyond that. We need intervention strategies to keep people out of trouble. I'm very proud of the Schiff Cardenas Crime Prevention Act that I co-authored, which has been among the longest running programs in the state to try to keep youth engaged in productive things in school and vocational efforts. We also need to do more investing in powerful tools to identify who's committing crimes. I brought millions back to address the rape kit backlog in Los Angeles City and County. I brought resources back to establish a regional DNA crime lab. We need to address the fentanyl crisis, which is also feeding a lot of this crime, people with a fentanyl addiction. And we need to do a better job interdicting fentanyl at the border and also using federal, state, and local task forces to go after some of the organized crime rings that are involved in fentanyl distribution. So no one, solution, but I would say among the most important is we're going to have to invest more heavily in community-based policing.
You mentioned that there's a perception that criminals are kind of getting away with these crimes. Do you believe in enhancing any sort of punishment currently?
I think, before we, and I know people are advocating that we revise these ballot measures that were passed in California. I don't think the data is there yet to support changes to the ballot measures. At least many point to the one that lower the threshold for what is considered a misdemeanor, or raise the threshold rather to what's considered a felony. But these smash and grab robberies are well over that limit. So I don't know that you can trace anything to a particular ballot measure. But again, I think people who are committing these crimes repeatedly, we need to hold them accountable for that entire conduct, not just one discrete thing followed by another discrete thing. And those that are engaged in the organized crime rings also need to be held accountable. Right now, they're not much at risk of being caught. And if they are caught, they're not at much risk of being held accountable for the cumulative crimes they've committed. And I think that has to change more than the length of sentence.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Alexi, now.
Hi, Congressman. Thanks for your time. Last year, you gave an interview on MSNBC in which you said that the only way to hold Fox News accountable for its lies about the election was to attack its profits. And you said that anyone who advertised on these stations was culpable in the destruction they were causing to democracy. Yet you are now advertising on Fox News in an effort to elevate your Republican opponent in this race. Why the change in opinion about advertising on Fox News? And is this a double standard between what you believe advertisers should do and what you're doing?
Well, I would love everyone to not be advertising on Fox. And I would certainly love to see every Democrat and Democratic inclined organization not advertising on Fox. But I can't do it on my own and solely, particularly in this race. One of my opponents was advertising on Fox. And I do believe you need to be speaking in the same medium that your opponents are speaking. So I can't unilaterally change this myself. And we're having to respond to what others are doing in the race. But yes, I think going after the profit at Fox broadly, and I'd love to see this done in a systematic way, could be one way of going after the money, which is the only thing Fox responds to. As Rupert Murdoch testified during his deposition in the Dominion voting litigation as to why they were pushing out the big lie, his answer was, it's not about the red or the blue, it's about the green. And I think unless we go after the green, they're going to continue doing what they're doing. But again, like campaign finance, it can't be done unilaterally by one candidate in a race if the others are doing something differently. It has to be, I think, a broad decision either by the party or even more than the party.
I know we're out of time here, so I think as a last question, I would just ask you, you and your Democratic opponents obviously share many of the same values and positions. So for voters who may still be undecided and trying to make up their mind between the three of you, what do you think is the biggest difference between you that you would tell an undecided voter about why they should support you?
I think it's really two things. One, it's our record of leadership in the really big fights. Our democracy has been really poised on a razor's edge because of the pernicious influence of Donald Trump. And only one of us stepped up in the middle of that fight, took on a president of the United States. I led his investigation. I led his first impeachment when he engaged in insurrection. I served on the January 6th committee to hold him accountable, and I took all the incoming that comes with that. And we need someone in the Senate who knows how to take on those big fights, is not unwilling to do so where it's necessary. But California also needs someone who knows how to get things done. And I'm proud to have built mass transit and built an early earthquake warning system. I'm proud to have authored California's Patient Bill of Rights and legislation to reduce class sizes and bring up-to-date textbooks to our schools. I'm proud to have passed bills to protect press freedom and attack nuclear proliferation. I'm proud to have brought millions back to California to build housing. And that's a record of delivering for California that none of my colleagues can approach. And it's also why 80% of the California House Democrats, including Speaker Pelosi, have weighed in this race and endorsed my campaign. Normally, when there's more than one candidate from a state delegation running, the others just stay out. but they haven't. They've gotten involved, and they got involved, I think, for the same reason that California voters have really gravitated to our campaign, and that is they realize the problems in the state are too significant to sit on the sidelines. We need to build a lot more housing and bring housing costs down. We need to bring childcare costs down. I don't want to see any family paying more than 5 or 10% of their income on childcare. We need to address water issues. We need to address public safety issues. And I have a record of delivering, of getting things done. And I think in a very real respect, this is a race between results and rhetoric. And I think voters are going to choose results.
Thank you.
Congressman, we know that you need to head to another meeting, so we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.